Hello. So there's two stacks here. These are all the books that I read in 2023. This year, I didn't read as many books as I would like to have, but I did get to read a lot more financial reports, like consolidated financial statements from 10K reports or annual reports. And so there's a bit of a trade-off there. My goal was to read a lot more finance books, actually, and I ended up reading not as many finance books as I wanted to. So I have to actually change that for the next year. But with that being said, let's see what I've actually read. So this isn't in chronological order, by the way. This is just random. They're all put up here randomly. So the first one is Love's Executioner by Irvin Yalom. This is a psychotherapy book, and it was actually a very fun read. And Yalom has a lot of interesting insights on common issues found not only in relationships, but also in people's personal lives. So I actually really enjoyed this book. I recommend reading it. The Atomic Habits. I read this book when it first came out, but not in a physical copy. And I started this thing where I started reading 10 pages from a self-help book a day. And so I decided to reread this one. I'm going to make a video talking about it more thoroughly. I think it's actually pretty bad for a self-help book. There are a lot better books out there. I'm assuming you have some basic knowledge, of course. If you know nothing about habits, then that's a great book. Dividend Stocks for Dummies. So part of my finance journey was to go through the basic stuff, even though it's basic. And I wanted to basically start from scratch. And so I read this book. It's okay if you know nothing about dividend stocks. Other than that, it's a bit too basic. The next one is Stock Investing for Dummies. Again, I just wanted to go through something quick. That focused on stocks. If you know nothing about stocks, it's okay. But other than that, not that it's, you probably get all these ideas from an Instagram page, basically. Benjamin Franklin by Walter Isaacson. This was a very good book. Walter Isaacson did a great job of showing both the downsides and the upsides of Benjamin Franklin. And Isaacson has an ability to write clearly that I really enjoy and I can follow along. Not just for 1 or 2 pages, but for many pages. This is a good book. I still haven't read the Elon Musk biography. We'll see. I don't really like Elon Musk that much anymore. That's a side topic. The Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. This was good actually, and the reason why is because I like Benjamin Franklin's writing style. Obviously, this is a bit too favorable of an opinion of himself. But there are some great ideas in here about how to work throughout the day. He has a little schedule on how to adopt habits and stuff. And you get to see at least his own reflections on his life. And again, a writing style that's pretty fancy. So this was a book I got for Christmas last year, The Guide to Financial Markets, Why They Exist and How They Work. And this is actually probably better than the other 2 books on finance that I read. This actually does go into financial markets, and it provides up-to-date data on financial markets, which is lovely. And it even goes into securitization and securitization as a market, which I was really impressed with. Definitely a little bit better of a book than I was expecting, but it is, again, basic and introductory. And the language in here can be a bit thick. So if you know nothing about finance, maybe just stick with the textbook and then read this as a supplement. Now, this book, I'm surprised I actually read this year because I feel like I've used this book the most. This is the Interpretation of Financial Statements, which is a famous book. The original one is called The Interpretation of Financial Statements by Benjamin Graham. This one is by Mary Buffett and David Clark. And this book was fantastic. The reason why I feel like I can't believe I read this just this year alone is because I've taken basically all the ratios from each chapter. Each chapter goes over an important financial ratio, and I've taken each one. There's about 80 of them or so, and I've used them to analyze consolidated financial statements. And I've probably read at least a quick overview of probably 300 to 400 companies' financial statements. And then I went and modeled the entire consolidated financial statements of probably 50 companies using a lot of the ideas from this book. So I can't believe it's only been 1 year since I read this book. That's a fantastic book. It's probably the most useful book I read this year. The Everything Store. This is an Amazon book about Amazon, sorry. And I did appreciate seeing some of the narrative behind Amazon, and it's kind of meant to be like a quasi-biography of Amazon. But when I picked it up, I was looking for like a straight up business book about Amazon, not necessarily a journalistic approach. And this book kind of approaches Amazon like a journalist would. Sometimes there's data, sometimes there's discussions about business models, but there's also a lot of discussions about Bezos and who he is as a person and his family background, stuff like that. There's also a follow-up to this book that I was considering getting, but everybody said it was the same book, and it was basically a biography of Bezos. So this book is like a 6 out of 10, and there's another book in here that is much better. Oil, Power, and War. This might be definitely like this. Maybe this. I'll say that maybe this might be the best book I've read this year. It's not the most useful book because the interpretation of financial statements is in this list, but this was definitely, my worldview changed a lot from reading this book. He talks about, for example, things like the 2008 financial crisis. A lot of banks had money invested into the energy sector, and the price of oil skyrocketed to like $145 per barrel right before the 2008 financial crisis, which made things really expensive in general. How, for example, nations in World War II were talking about their need for oil in order to have a mechanized infantry, and how, like, for example, generals in Japan would say that they're not going to let their nations become third world nations, so they want oil. The role that oil plays in everything. Even in the 2003 invasion, talks about that a lot. This is a fantastic book. I could go on for probably like 20 minutes talking about the important ideas inside this book. The Balkans, Nationalism, War, and the Great Powers. This was a fantastic book that I think did a fair job of listing the pros and cons of every nation in the Balkans, right? From talking about the failure of the Tanzimat reforms from the Ottoman Empire to the failure of the Balkan nations to actually cooperate against greater powers that had a complete and total interest of keeping them divided, right? The great powers at the time, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Britain, all had interest in keeping the Balkans on their side, like different Balkan nations. And then also, again, a fair assessment of the ethnic tensions between the different Balkan nations, because it goes up to 2012. This is an updated edition. This was a fantastic book as well. I highly recommend reading this. There's a lot in there. So this was one of the fiction books I read this year, Out by Kirano. And this was fantastic. It's about basically lower class workers who work in a factory in Japan, and how societal struggles, specifically economic, but also social pressure, lead them to do crimes that they wouldn't otherwise do. And I think it's a fantastic book that you can read it as a way of making commentary about the high pressure that you find inside East Asian societies and the difficulty that people have to get out of their impoverished positions. The Three-Body Problem. This was a fantastic science fiction book. Everyone loves this book when they recommend it. I have the other two that I haven't gotten to. I'll probably try and read them this year. I don't want to spoil too much about this book, but I'll just say that this is a fantastic fiction book, and I'm not one who likes fiction that much. The Conditions of Love. So the Philosophy of Intimacy. This was a fun book to read. Basically going over different ideas about love, so like love and evolution, or love and Aristotle, or who can fall in love. Also talks about like literature and love, so like Werther's conception of love, the intense romanticism associated with that, which then leads to also like, can you define love? What are different definitions of love? What does Wittgenstein versus, let's say, Aristotle have to say about love? It's a pretty good book, especially for its size. I really enjoyed it. The Politics of Experience and The Bird of Paradise. This is actually 2 books. And to be honest, I can't remember much about this book. All I remember is that there's politics involved in classifying human experiences, and there's also politics involved in setting societal norms. And he's trying to highlight these things to the best of his ability. But he does use abstract language, which might even be one of the reasons why I can't remember much about that book. So this one was recently read. I won't talk too much about this because I'm going to mention it in my recent reads videos. Course of German History by A.G.B. Taylor. This was a good book on German history, and I would say he does a good assessment of looking at the connections from before Prussia, just before Prussia, like basically right after the Holy Roman Empire, up into modern German history. He has a lot to say about the First and Second World War. Putin's People, this was again another recent read, so I won't say too much about this. I'll mention it in my next video, but this was fantastic. Obviously there's bias. You don't have a lot of arguments against the Western dominant perspective inside this book, but there is a lot of weight behind what they're saying, like in terms of evidence, that although nothing is definitive, like you can't prove a lot of this stuff because it's like, I don't know, someone who was a former oligarch or someone who formerly worked for a bank in Russia or someone who formerly worked for the KGB. That stuff, obviously, you have to have a grain of skepticism towards those kinds of reports. But there's also documentation, even within Russia, like lawyers who would be ignored or so on and so forth. I would say this book is definitely worth the read, but you have to read it with a skeptical eye. Before The Hidden DNA of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google is the business book that I wanted to read. I think I read The Everything Store first, and then I read this book. And this book is great. This book actually goes over data, talks about like how Amazon consumes market share, how Apple's year-over-year growth for new users is in a declining slope. It's a declining rate. Stuff like this, right? It actually goes over important data that is useful for you as someone who might want to invest or understand market dynamics a little bit better. This was actually a good business book. Rene Descartes, Discord and Discord on Method and the Meditation. So this is 2 books in one. I think I read this book a long time ago, like literally like high school. So I decided to reread a newer copy that I got. I read Discourse on Method, I think, in high school. And then the Meditations was new to me. And then there's another one that I have that covers, I think, some of his letters. It's worth reading. There is a bit of, I think you'll gain some insight because Descartes changes his position a little bit on some of his ideas, and people often represent him as being this like pillar of uniformity, as if his opinions didn't change, but they did change. And there's even some ideas in here that you might surprise you. For example, that Descartes thinks is "I think, therefore I am" is perfect knowledge, and that therefore justifies the belief in God, because perfect knowledge has to be contingent on a perfect being, which seems way further than the kind of Descartes the image of Descartes you get in popular culture. Why the Germans do it better? This was an okay book. I wouldn't say if you want to get into modern history of Germany, this is worth reading as a supplement, because he's a British journalist who lived in Germany. And he basically argues that modern Germany does things a lot better in terms of, let's say, how they handled COVID. This is a very recent book. How they handled COVID, how they're handling the challenge of the emerging electric vehicle market, energy policy, things like this, right? To be fair, he also critiques the financial markets in Germany, which are a little bit sloppy. A Real Safe for Democracy. I won't talk about this too much. This is a shit book. Am I allowed to say that? I think so. This is a very bad book. I would give it like a 5 out of 10. It repeats itself throughout the whole time. Like one of the things he would do is repeatedly explain what international liberalism is and kind of connect that to points he was making. But what he should have done was just understand that after chapter 1, everybody understands what international liberalism is. You don't have to keep explaining it. And there was very little data to support that democracies are safer inside an international liberal environment, which is one of the theses of the book. To be fair, he does talk about international liberalism's hegemonic influence, which is great, but that's probably the only benefit of the book that I'm going to throw out there. David Sinclair's Lifespan. This book was okay, but it came short on a lot of. Basically, this book does a lot of theoretical, like proof of concept, and then kind of talks about how this is going to change the aging field. Like, for instance, injecting sirtuin genes into the epigenome, or not the epigenome, I think just putting them in your body can fix physical damage. That's a great proof of concept, because there was one study where they did it with like an optic nerve of a mouse. Great proof of concept study. Also talks about resveratrol, and he brings up some of the proof of concept studies there. He also talks about epigenetic influence of dietary practice on the rate of aging, but he only does it in small animals, which I've seen other biologists say that this works better in small animals and doesn't work in bigger animals. Specifically, Aubrey de Grey has said this. So it's too much proof of concept, not enough data. And like when it even comes to, I wish he would have talked more about the supplements that people take, like NMN, but he doesn't. He only talks about his own usage of it and says maybe you should wait for studies. But yeah, I wish he would have taken a more journalistic approach to some things. Making the Modern Middle East. This was a great book for understanding the origins of the nationalist movements inside the Middle East. So when you read this book, don't think you're going to get a history of the Middle East. You're going to get the origins of Arab nationalism. You're going to get the origins of Zionism. And even to some extent, you'll get the origins of Saudi Arabia, which is not the same thing as Arab nationalism, really. Arab nationalism comes from Jordan. And then on top of that, you'll see the influence of colonial powers playing off the different nationalist groups, namely France and Britain. I think France had more connection with Arab nationalists because they had Syria, and Syria was going to be absorbed into the Arab kingdom, I think, for Jordan. There was a leader there. And obviously then the British were fighting the Turks through... there's another Arab that was going to be a nationalist that they were using to fight the Ottoman Empire, right? So stuff like this, right? That's what you'll get from this book. It's not a general history. It's more like talking about the nationalist movements. Psychotherapies of the Disorders of the Self, the Masterson's approach. This was a fun read. If you have no interest in psychotherapy, don't read this. It is a long book. But if you're someone who really likes to consider like the puzzling elements of therapy, so like how different traumatic events connect to current day behaviors and stuff like this, then read this book. It's pretty interesting what he has to say. Next is Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works. I read this book a long time ago, but I decided to reread it this year because I forgot a lot about it. And I forgot how technical of a book it was. There are some pretty technical chapters in here. For example, like he goes over a computational approach to visual perception. Basically, he's going to argue a materialist worldview where like the mind is whatever the brain is doing. And so let's discuss what the brain is doing and connect that to our experiences of the mind. That's kind of his approach. But there's a lot of technical stuff in here. This might be one of his more technical books. The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion by Jonathan Haidt. This was a fantastic book. I really enjoyed reading this. It wasn't too difficult to read, and what I really liked is he has some models in here that are kind of interesting. He calls it the Moral Foundations Theory, and there are some online tests you can take with it to see where you score. And there were some interesting insights that come from the Moral Foundations Theory, like that conservatives actually are more evenly balanced in different moral categories, whereas liberals, in the American sense, are actually disproportionately balanced towards things like pain and suffering. Yeah, it was an interesting book, and I have a book review of it. And then the last book that I read was The Moral Animal, Why We Are the Way We Are by Robert Wright. This is an okay book. If you know nothing about evolutionary psychology, it's not a bad starting place. I wish the chapters on Darwin's history and life were deleted from this book. I don't care about that. Although I am reading a Darwin biography. It's just I don't want it from this book. He does a good job of explaining the core ideas behind evolutionary psychology. I would say The Moral Animal is misleading. This book isn't so much about why we have morality. It's more like, what is evolutionary psychology? And then there's a couple of chapters explaining why evolutionary psychology can give us moral capacities. I think that's a better way of explaining this book. The Moral Animal is a bit of a misleading title. So those are the books I read in 2023. I want to read a few more next year, and hopefully I bias more towards finance. I would like to read at least 10 finance books next year, including some textbooks. But you know how reading goes. Year comes up, something happens. If you have any books you want me to read for this year, let me know. I'll definitely check them out. I often buy books that you guys recommend. But with that being said, bye-bye.